The temperature outside is -40 degrees Celsius. That's not a metaphor. That's not something from a war film. That is the actual measured air temperature recorded on the Kollaa front in the winter of 1939 in the forests of southeastern Finland, a place so cold that the pine trees cracked open like rifle shots in the night. Somewhere in those trees, a man named Simo Heiha was lying face down in the snow. He had been there for hours, maybe longer. His white camouflage suit blended so perfectly into the landscape that he was essentially invisible, a ghost pressed flat against the earth. He had packed snow into his mouth to stop his breath from forming a cloud of vapor that a Soviet spotter could pick up through binoculars. His fingers were numb. His rifle barrel was frosted. The temperature could freeze exposed skin in under 3 minutes, and yet he was completely calm. He did not have a telescopic scope on his rifle. He never used one. He didn't need one. The Soviet Red Army had crossed into Finland 8 weeks earlier with nearly 500,000 men, over 1,000 aircraft, and the full weight of a military superpower behind them. They had expected a swift, almost embarrassing victory. They expected Finland to fall in days. Some Soviet commanders reportedly told their troops to pack only summer uniforms. They wouldn't be there long enough to need anything heavier. What they got instead was one of the most humiliating military campaigns in the history of a major world power, and at the center of it, not a general, not a tank column, not an air wing, was a 34-year-old farmer from a small village who had spent the previous decade raising crops, hunting moose and shooting targets for fun. What happened at the Kollaa River over the following 100 days is not a story that any country fully wants to tell. It's not clean. It's not simple. It asks uncomfortable questions about what human beings are actually capable of, under pressure, in the cold, without recognition, and without glory. This is the story of Simo Heiha, and it's not the version you've heard before. Here's what gets almost no attention in the stories about Simo Heiha. Before the war, he was completely ordinary by his own definition. He was born on December 17, 1905, in the small municipality of Rautjärvi, in southern Finland, close to the border that would eventually become a front line. He was the 7th of 8 children in a Lutheran farming family. His childhood was exactly what you would expect in rural Finland at the start of the 20th century. Hard winters, physical labor, a deep familiarity with the forest, and a culture built around self-sufficiency. At 17, he joined the Finnish Civil Guard, the Suojeluskunta, a voluntary militia organization that was a core part of Finnish civic life at the time. This was not unusual. This was what young men in his part of the country did. What was unusual was how quickly he distinguished himself as a marksman. He competed in shooting contests. He won trophies. He trained seriously, consistently, and without a great deal of drama about it. In the late 1920s, he completed his mandatory military service. He continued farming. He hunted moose in the same forests where he would later fight. He knew the terrain the way a person knows the rooms of their own house. In 1938, just 1 year before the war, he qualified for formal sniper training at the Uti Training Center. Instructors there noted something specific about him, an exceptional ability to accurately estimate distance to remote objects without any optical aids. That's a skill most people simply cannot develop. For Heiha, it came naturally, sharpened by years of hunting in dense forest, where you don't always have a clear line of sight. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland on November 30th, 1939, Heiha was 34 years old. He was not a special forces operator. He was not a career soldier with combat experience. He was a farmer and hunter who had spent 2 decades getting very, very good at a specific set of skills, in a specific landscape under specific conditions. He was assigned to the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34, defending the Kollaa sector. And here's what almost nobody talks about. The men defending Kollaa were not elite troops. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. The Finnish 12th Division, which held the entire front, faced Soviet forces estimated to be 4 times their size or greater. The math was brutal. The position was supposed to be indefensible. There's a famous phrase from that period, spoken by a Finnish general defending the Kollaa line. When asked if the position would hold, He is reported to have said, "Kollaa kestää kaun." Kollaa will hold. It held. But the question nobody asks is, how? Before you can understand what Simo Häyhä did at Kollaa, you need to understand what the Soviet Union actually sent into Finland and why it failed so completely in the first phase of the war. On November 30th, 1939, the Red Army crossed the Finnish border with approximately 465,000 men. Helsinki was bombed that same day. The Soviets had prepared a puppet government to take control of Finland after what they expected to be a short campaign. They had numerical superiority. They had air power, they had armor. By every conventional military calculation, Finland should have collapsed. The reason this didn't happen in the first 2 months is, in part, geographic. Finland in winter is not a theater that rewards conventional military doctrine. The terrain is dense boreal forest, broken by lakes, rivers, and swamps, most of which are frozen solid in winter, but not reliably, and not in ways that support armored column movement. Roads in that region were few and often primitive. Soviet mechanized units, trained for open-steppe warfare, found themselves channeled onto narrow forest roads where their column formations became death traps. Finnish forces used what became known as motti tactics. Small mobile ski units would encircle sections of a Soviet column in the forest, cutting it off from resupply and reinforcement, then systematically destroy it piece by piece. A Soviet armored column would advance down a road, find itself surrounded on both sides by invisible Finnish troops in white camouflage, and face an enemy that could move through the snow-covered forest at speeds the Soviets couldn't match. The temperature made everything worse for the Red Army. Soviet troops who arrived in summer uniforms, because someone in the command structure had actually believed the campaign would be over before winter set in, suffered catastrophic cold injuries. Frostbite, hypothermia. Soldiers who stopped moving in the open for too long simply didn't get up again. The Finns, by contrast, were fighting on home terrain. They knew the forests, they had the equipment, they had the motivation, and they had snipers. Soviet soldiers began to develop a specific documented fear. Finnish snipers seemed to materialize from nowhere, strike without warning, and disappear. Reports from surviving Soviet veterans describe an almost paralyzing dread of moving in the open. You couldn't see them, you couldn't locate them. The forest itself seemed to be killing you. One name, above all others, became embedded in the Soviet experience of the Kollaa front. The Soviets called him Belaya Smrt, the White Death. And if you think you already know what comes next, you don't. Because the real mechanics of how he operated are nothing like what gets repeated online. This is where the story usually gets embellished, where numbers get inflated and the man starts to become a myth rather than a human being. Let's go through what the documented record actually shows, because the reality is extraordinary enough without embellishment. Häyhä's rifle was a Finnish-produced Mosin-Nagant M2830. This was a standard military-issue bolt-action rifle, chambered in 7.62-54mm. He chose to shoot with iron sights, the standard open metal sights built into the rifle, rather than a telescopic scope. His reasoning was practical and documented. A telescopic scope in extreme cold can fog up on the interior lens. More critically, the glass face of a scope can catch and reflect sunlight, what snipers call scope glint, and that reflection can reveal a sniper's position to an enemy observer before the sniper ever fires. Iron sights have no glass. They produce no reflection. They don't fog. At the distances he was shooting, within the effective range his hunting experience had trained him for, he trusted his own eyesight and his instinct for distance over any optic. He wore a white camouflage suit over his winter uniform. He positioned himself in covered, concealed positions, often in hollows in the snow, sometimes in dugouts against tree roots, always in positions that gave him a clear field of fire while minimizing his own silhouette. He would pack snow into his mouth and nose to suppress the visible vapor cloud his breathing would create in the freezing air. A detail that sounds almost cinematic, but is documented in multiple historical accounts and confirmed by interviews conducted with him decades later. His approach to avoiding detection went further. He understood that the muzzle blast of a rifle in cold, dry air can produce a visible disturbance, a brief disruption of the snow or frost in front of the barrel. Before each position, He would compact and firm the snow in his firing arc to eliminate this tell. He studied the light. He moved between positions carefully, leaving as little track evidence as possible. His daily routine during the war was precise. He rose before dawn. He moved to position. He waited. He did not rush. He engaged targets at ranges where he was confident, generally within several hundred meters, but the documented accounts note consistent accuracy at longer distances as well. He did not fire unnecessarily. The Soviet response, when they began to understand what they were dealing with, was significant. They sent counter-snipers specifically tasked with finding and eliminating him. Artillery was reportedly directed at areas where he was thought to be operating. At least one dedicated Soviet sniper team was deployed to hunt him. That Soviet sniper, whose specific identity is not recorded in the Finnish accounts, was eventually found by Heha. He reportedly mentioned it with minimal commentary when asked about it years later. The psychological impact on Soviet units in the Kollaa sector went beyond the tactical. There are documented Soviet reports describing extreme reluctance among Red Army soldiers to move in the open on the Finnish side of the front. Finnish commanders noted that Soviet advance operations in certain sectors became hesitant and poorly coordinated in ways that tracked with Heha's known operational areas. A single marksman was suppressing movement across stretches of the front line. Now here is where historical honesty is required, because this is a topic where numbers are often thrown around without context. The exact kill count attributed to Heha is disputed and has been disputed consistently among serious historians. The figure of 500, which appears in the title of this video and in most popular accounts, is derived from accumulated tallies from his unit, corroborated by a military chaplain's diary of the period and informal counts kept by his company. The figure of 219 confirmed sniper kills was cited by Division Commander Antero Svensson, who credited him with an equal number of kills using his Suomi KP-31 submachine gun in close engagement situations, bringing reported totals near the 400-plus range. Some tallies, including the chaplain's diary figure of 259 sniper kills alone, push the combined total higher. The number 505 specifically appears in some accounts from the post-war period, but its precision should be taken as an approximation rather than a verified official record, because formal sniper record-keeping of this granularity was not standard military practice on the Finnish side, where killing itself was considered an unglamorous but necessary function of defense, not something to be officially catalogued with exactitude. What is not disputed? The scope of his documented activity during 98 days of combat made him the most feared single fighter on the Kollaa front and one of the most documented snipers of the entire Winter War. The confirmed range of his kills, whatever the precise number, placed him in a category with no meaningful parallel in the conflict. And then, on March 6, 1940, a week before the war ended, something happened. March 6, 1940. Heha was in position. A Soviet attack was underway on the Kollaa front, one of the Red Army's sustained pushes in the final weeks of the war, when the Soviets had reorganized, reinforced, and were finally applying coordinated pressure with their full weight. He was struck in the lower left jaw by an explosive bullet. The damage was catastrophic. The round shattered his jawbone and tore away a significant portion of his left cheek. He lost consciousness immediately. His fellow Finnish soldiers, coming across him in the aftermath of the engagement, believed he was dead. He was placed among the fallen. A comrade noticed his leg moving. Sit with that for a second. 98 days holding that line. And it ended with him in a pile of the dead in the snow a week before the ceasefire. If this story is landing differently than what you've seen before, hit like. It tells us to keep making history like this instead of the surface-level stuff. He was evacuated. He was taken to the Coma hospital near Jyväskylä. He spent the final week of the Winter War, which ended March 13, 1940, in a coma. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed while he lay unconscious. Over the following months, he underwent approximately 26 separate surgical operations. His jaw was reconstructed using bone taken from his own hip. He was unable to eat solid food or speak for 3 to 4 months. He eventually had to be fitted with dentures. He had survived, barely, and the war he had fought in was already over. The peace terms were harsh for Finland. The Moscow Peace Treaty forced Finland to cede approximately 11% of its pre-war territory, including the strategically important Karelian Isthmus, the city of Viborg and other regions. Finland lost significant population centers and industrial capacity. Around 430,000 Finns, roughly 12% of the country's total population, were evacuated from the ceded territories and resettled inside what remained of Finland's borders. Heha returned to civilian life. He did not become a celebrity. He did not seek interviews or write memoirs. He went back to Rautjärvi. He continued farming. He became a moose hunter and eventually a dog breeder. He lived, by all accounts, a quiet and private life. The war, in his own words, was something he had done because it had to be done. But why it had to be done at all, and why the outcome of these 100 days still echoes across the rest of the 20th century, that's the part almost nobody shows you. Here's what gets cut out of the popular version of this story. The kill count is real, the legend is documented. But stripped of its context, it's just a number, and numbers without context are how history gets turned into entertainment instead of understanding. So here's the context. Here is what the Winter War actually was, at the level that histories tend to skip. The Soviet Union had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany in August 1939, including a secret protocol that placed Finland within the Soviet sphere. When Finland refused Moscow's territorial demands that would have placed Soviet military bases on Finnish soil, Stalin ordered the invasion. The Soviets fabricated a border incident to justify it. They had already set up a puppet government, the Finnish Democratic Republic, to install in Helsinki once the campaign ended. This was not a war of mutual aggression. It was a military invasion of a sovereign nation by a superpower that expected it to be over in weeks. Finland had a population of 3.7 million. The Red Army committed close to 1 million men to the theatre by the war's end. Finland never fielded more than 300,000 to 340,000 soldiers total. Finnish dead are estimated at 25,000 to 30,000. Soviet losses, underreported for decades, are now placed by historians at between 125,000 and 165,000 killed, with total casualties far higher. The Red Army's performance in the first months of the war reverberated far beyond Finland. Hitler was watching. A military superpower had just spent months struggling to subdue a nation 1/50th its size. The Red Army, the force that Nazi Germany would eventually have to fight, looked brittle, disorganized, beatable. Some historians argue the Winter War directly influenced Hitler's revised assessment of Soviet military capability and, by extension, the timing and ambition of Operation Barbarossa, the 1941 German invasion of the USSR that became the bloodiest single conflict in recorded human history, a chain of consequences. From a frozen riverbank in Karelia to the Eastern Front, and in the middle of it, a farmer lay in the snow with an iron-sighted rifle, holding his section of the line. In interviews conducted decades after the war, most notably with military historian Tapio Saarelainen, Heha did not speak about his service with pride or theatrics. He was matter-of-fact. When asked whether he targeted officers specifically, he said he shot whenever he saw the enemy. He did not care whether the man was a leader or not. When asked in one of his later interviews what made a good sniper, he answered without hesitation, "Without really good fitness, it is just impossible to be a sniper. Not marksmanship, not natural talent for killing. Fitness. The answer of a practical man from a practical tradition." That is the most honest window into who Simo Heha actually was. Not a mythologized ghost, not a figure of wartime propaganda, but a man with documented skills applied under the most brutal conditions imaginable in defense of something he considered worth defending. He did not romanticize it, he simply did it. Simo Heha outlived the Soviet Union. He outlived Stalin. He outlived the Cold War. He outlived the regime that had sent 1 million soldiers to conquer his country and failed. He died on April 1st, 2002, at the age of 96 in Hamina, Finland. In the decades after the war, he had lived almost exactly the life he had before it. Farming, hunting moose, breeding dogs, staying close to the land and forests of southern Finland that he had known since childhood. In his final years, he gave limited interviews. He accepted a few visitors who came specifically to learn about the Winter War. He remained, by nearly every account of people who met him, modest, quiet, and entirely uninterested in the mythology that had accumulated around his name. He never wrote a book. He never appeared in a documentary. He didn't seek the attention that would eventually find him anyway. The contrast with how wars are typically narrated is almost jarring. Wars generate enormous amounts of official narrative. Medals, commemorations, monuments, state-sanctioned history. The individuals in those wars are often pressed into service of that narrative long after the fighting ends. They become symbols. They become proof of one side's virtue or the other's depravity. The human being gets hollowed out and replaced with a usable abstraction. Heha resisted that, perhaps without even trying. He had been a farmer. He defended his country. He came home. He went back to farming. The Winter War itself ended in a complicated place. Finland had not been conquered. Its independence was preserved, but it paid a heavy price in territory and population displacement. The 430,000 Finns evacuated from the ceded territories, approximately 1 in 8 Finns at the time, had to rebuild their lives inside a smaller country. Many of those evacuees were from Karelia, a region with deep roots in Finnish history and culture, and the loss of Karelia became one of the defining wounds in 20th century Finnish national consciousness. In 1940, Finland became the subject of intense international attention. Volunteers from Sweden, Norway, Hungary, and Italy traveled to fight alongside Finnish forces. International sympathy was enormous. The League of Nations expelled the Soviet Union from the organization in December 1939. One of the only times in the institution's entire history that it took that kind of decisive step against a member state. None of it was enough to change the terms. None of that attention, none of that sympathy, and none of those volunteers changed what the Finns themselves had to do on the ground, alone, in the worst winter conditions imaginable with the resources they had. Simo Heha was one of approximately 300,000 men who stood in that line. He was unique in what he could do with a rifle and a snowbank. He was not unique in what he represented, a civilian population that was required, by circumstances entirely outside its control, to become something it had never chosen to be. That is the side of war that nobody shows you. Not the glory, not the numbers, not the legend of the White Death who killed 500 soldiers in 100 days. The reality is a man with a broken jaw, 34 years old, waking up from a coma in a hospital bed, while the peace treaty that ended the war he fought was already being signed. His country had held. His section of the line had held. He would never fight again. His face had been partially rebuilt from his own bone. He went home to his farm. He picked up his rifle again, not for war, but for moose hunting in the same forests, and he kept living quietly for 60 more years. If this video gave you something you didn't already know, not just the number but the real context behind it, hit the like button. It's the best way to tell us that this kind of in-depth documented history is what you want more of from Warblind. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. Because the next story we're telling on this channel is one that makes the Winter War look like a warm-up. And it starts with a decision made in a single afternoon in 1941 that changed the course of the deadliest conflict in human history. Drop a comment below. Did you know the full story of the Winter War before today? Or was there something here that genuinely surprised you? We read every single one. We'll see you in the next one.